Greetings, brothers and sisters in Christ. Good to have you back for another video here on James. We're going to be looking at James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. And so we're going to continue the trend of kind of short videos on singular points so we don't kind of get bogged down in a long, kind of drawn-out discussion on texts that are semi-related sort of thing. So I'm going to kind of do it in small chunks, keep the videos a little bit shorter that way, a little easier to digest. All right, so we're going to look at chapter 5, verses 1 through 6 here in James. So it begins, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you." All right. That's little rough start here to the text, but let's talk a little bit about who's being addressed. Okay, if we were to go back, and I'm gonna scroll here for a moment. If we are to go back, we see in verse 1, James, the servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. Okay, this idea of dispersion or exile has to do with the idea that they are sojourners, foreigners in their land. They had to leave their homeland of Jerusalem, and so they're susceptible to persecution is basically kind of the thought here. Especially those who are poor, and many early Christians were poor because it gave them their humanity and an equal footing with all those in the church, and so the Christians saw value in the poor and saw them as people worthy of the gospel. However, that does not change the fact that they live in a society that lifts up the rich and pushes down the poor. And so, because James is writing to a group of people that are likely not in their hometowns anymore, they don't have the kind of social connections they once had. They don't have the social safety nets of having their family be part of the community, longstanding members of the community, or that they have property or a home, they have land to farm. Now they're pushed out from the familiar and are now in the foreign, whether or not they've been pushed out just of Jerusalem, or whether they've been pushed out of Judea, or whether they've been pushed out of wherever they've been dispersed to. And because of that, they are now susceptible to not just persecution, but injustice and corruption, which is going to play a role when we get into this section over here about patience and suffering. And so, as we're looking at this section, the question that commentators and as we as Christians have to sort of deal with is, when he says, "Come now, you rich," is he speaking about rich Christians, or that's Christ, the symbol of Christ, and a very poorly written ands, so Christians, or rich pagans or unbelievers? Now, we've had harsh words in James. We've had plenty of harsh words. Our 2 videos ago, it started off with "you adulterous people," speaking to the community of faithful people about their double-mindedness. Now, one could say that, James is now turning his attention to the rich Christians in the church, and that they have abused their fellow Christians, and they've abused others in order to receive their wealth. And that is a bit more what we see with that sort of following that path of interpretation. We have a tendency to go towards social gospel, and this idea that the gospel is for the poor and to overthrow the rich and to kind of overthrow systems of oppression. And we kind of get into this 21st century identity politics and sort of different things. And how has your privilege sort of abused others, kind of line of thinking. And that's not what James is doing here. And I say that because because 1 to 6 is all about, in a sense, damnation. This is wrath of God coming upon them on the last day, kind of speaking. This is final judgment. The fattened hearts in a day of slaughter. When is the day of slaughter? It's the day of judgment of God. And so this is why I don't think it's rich Christians. I think it's rich pagans. And so it's a warning, it's a written warning to those who might hear from outside of the Christian community, who maybe are visiting, who are intruding on their worship, or thinking that they can be a part of these things without sort of correction. And so this is it's a warning against the rich pagans, because what's going to happen next down here is an encouragement to those who are suffering under those who are rich and of the world. And so if we see this part down here being an encouragement, this too can serve as an encouragement. If you, in a sense, you can have patience in your trials and tribulations if you know the person who's committing injustice against you will get their due reward for their injustice, that they will be punished by God, that God does not ignore their corruption, their injustice, their violence against them, that they will instead be judged for that. And so when James provides this warning to the rich, it's an encouragement to those who are being persecuted, those who are suffering, those who are dealing with corruption and injustice, and one of the main thoughts here of having their wages withheld, kept back by fraud, right? And so they are being economically punished as well as socially punished by these rich pagans. So looking at so now we kind of got that who's being addressed here, makes it a little bit easier to deal with the text and somewhat lets you off the hook if you were feeling like, oh, is God talking to me? I have a nice retirement account, or I make a good wage, and am I doing these things? Have I fattened my heart in a day of slaughter? That doesn't sound like a good thing. And if the law impacts your heart, let it do so. But the main addressee is rich pagans. So weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Miseries coming upon you. Again, we're looking ahead to the last day. Your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. So these temporary things have been destroyed. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you. This is an interesting thought, because if their gold and silver is being used and exchanged, it won't corrode. But if it's sitting by itself in a place, it might then corrode and rust. And so if you're hoarding your wealth, that will be its corrosion will be evidence against you. The fact that you never used it for anything except to hoard it is going to speak against you. You did not help your brother or sister. You did not assist them. You did not be a wise steward of the gifts given to you by God. And so it will eat your flesh like fire. The same idea of corrosion of resources will also point to a corrosion of your own flesh. And so flesh like fire. And that idea of hoarding then comes from this next part. You have laid up treasure in the last days. But this treasure is one that corrodes and rusts and is moth-eaten and rotted. It's a temporary treasure. Behold, look, see. What am I looking at here? Well, see the more evidence. The wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back. So how did you get this wealth that corroded? Well, it was by fraud. And so now the very wages are crying out against you. So the wages, not the laborers, the wages are crying out against you. Because they're all hoarded up and corroding and rotting away. These things are speaking against the person who's hoarded them, who's laid up this treasure for themselves in the last day. But it's being confessed that it's by fraud and injustice. So the wages are crying out, and the cries of the harvesters. So they have two witnesses. You have the witness of the treasure, and the witness of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. Now, this is significant in that I can't erase with my finger. That's not how any of this works. Exodus language is being used here, the language of the Pharaoh and the slaves. The cries of the people have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. So this is Exodus kind of language. The judgment of the Pharaoh and Egypt will fall upon those who have held back by fraud and through corruption and abused the people of God. So again, this is why this rich pagans language rather than rich Christians language is because the language of Exodus is showing up, the Pharaoh versus the people of God kind of stuff. And so you have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. So beware of those who live in luxury and self-indulgence. How have you gained your wealth? And you have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. This idea of fattening your heart. So Exodus language, Pharaoh language, slave language, injustice, corruption, all of these things are going on here, which has then led to you have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you, for that is what a righteous person does. He doesn't resist evil in a sense. So that's not to say we shouldn't be active against evil things and injustice. We should speak against it as righteous people. But if a righteous person is being abused, they will turn the other cheek. They will allow it to happen. They won't resist the person who asks them to go with them a mile or asks for their cloak and he gives them their tunic too. This sort of idea of allowing abuse to come to the one who is being abused through injustice and corruption. A righteous person will allow it to occur. And he won't fight back necessarily. Now, there are times in which a righteous person can and should, and so we have to be careful about sort of pacifism versus an allowance of things to occur. And this kind of gets back to the idea of self-defense versus allowing things to be taken. Where is that line? How does it work? We were having a conversation a couple months back about among us pastors, and somebody had talked to the local law enforcement officer and asked, what percentage of people in this town own guns, and it was something like 45% or 50% of houses in the town have guns. And so we were kind of having a little bit of a theological conversation about, is it good, right, and salutary to own firearms for the purpose of self-defense or of home defense, right? Can you resist someone who's breaking into your home? Maybe. And that's a different conversation that would require a much longer video. But it's not cut and dry. because it's sort of, the question becomes, well, what are you preserving? Are you stopping a robber from stealing your TV and shooting them and killing them because they wanted to steal your TV? Is your TV worth is their life equal to the value of your television? I think most Christians would say, well, no. If they come in to steal your jewelry and your television and, I don't know, your laptop, is it worth shooting them for it? Probably not. It's not a life sentence kind of judgment. If they've come to harm your family and take their lives, well, now we're in a different kind of situation, aren't we? Now it requires defense of life. And so when do we resist? Well, what's being taken? Is something temporary being taken, or something of greater value? Now, one could even go so far as to say that even the earthly life of family is temporary and therefore should be allowed to be taken rather than resisted. However, that's not typically the way theologians have approached it. There are some, obviously, who do. But the martyrs, for example, allow their lives to be taken. They don't give up others' lives. So there's distinctions here, sort of ethically speaking, about when we resist and when we allow someone to take life and that sort of thing. And so, again, like I said, more complicated kind of question, but I kind of wanted to address it a little bit there at the end, in that James equates resisting or not resisting with righteous people. A righteous person doesn't resist. Well, what's been the topic of conversation? Money. If I'm going to fight in court, or if I'm going to fight in life, as in with violence, fisticuffs, over $10, well, what do I think about that person's value? What do I think is most important? And so, am I going to resist someone who cheats me out of $10, or that sort of thing? How do we deal with wage theft? So that's a little bit there of that end part, what we're getting after here, that the judgment will come upon those who have stolen, who have not been resisted, even though they've abused a righteous person. The righteous person has patience, as we sort of see in the next text. It's patience in suffering. And so the righteous person is patient. Okay. Well, that is that first section of chapter 5. We're going to look then at this next section on patience and suffering. I probably could tie them together, but I'm going to just give a break in the video because we're going to do this section, and then there is one final section at the end of chapter 5. So there's 2 videos remaining, and hope to see you there. And I hope you have a good rest of your week.